I'm Alex Rodriguez.
And I'm Jason Kelly.
From Bloomberg, this is The Deal. Each week, you'll hear us in conversation with business icons.
This show will explore deal-making across sports, media, and entertainment.
That is a harsh lesson in business.
Sports is not as simple as bringing a bunch of big names together.
I didn't want to do another stomp you out speech.
It opened up so many more doors.
The show is called The Deal.
Listen to The Deal.
Listen to The Deal on Spotify.
Welcome to the Flash Finds podcast, the world's fastest podcast where we explore how Facebook can help you with the stuff you're into. I'm Emma Rogue, joined by Nathan the Cat Lady, a Facebook creator. So Nathan, if you're into pets, what kind of stuff can you find on Facebook?
Well, I make reels about useful tips for pet owners. For instance, cats don't like still water, so all of my cats have cat fountains.
Oh my gosh, that's so cute. What a great episode. See you next time on the Flash Finds podcast, all about discovering the stuff on Facebook you care about. Bye.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. You know Amazon Prime is not just a shipping subscription, right? It's got everything, including streaming TV and movies on Prime Video. And of course, Prime's fast, free shipping. Go from watching your favorite shows to getting your favorite things. Whatever you're into, it's on Prime. Visit amazon.com/prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
Hello, mega orderers. Before we join our regularly scheduled programming about Ukraine, we need to ask the question, when a disorder-in-chief dies, is it good for global order? This question is very pressing as over the weekend, the Iranian President, Ibrahim Raisi, died in office. This has left the Islamic Republic of Iran and its hardline establishment facing a very uncertain future. Who was the 63-year-old Raisi? Well, he was a conservative who came from a clerical background and in a way was being groomed to replace the current supreme leader, Khamenei, who is now 85. Therefore, we're not just talking about the death of Iran's sitting president. We're talking about the death of its likely or potential big deal top future supreme leader. So, with this disorderer out of the way, and when I say disorderer, this is someone who, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, oversaw the killing of many, and then has overseen, since he was president, the vast repression of the hijab protests after the Iranian Kurdish woman was beaten to death for not wearing her hijab properly. So we're talking about an ultra-conservative here in Raisi, who has been a hardliner working with the clerical establishment to repress all forms of dissent. But is the death of a disorderer like this going to lead to order? Unlikely, because we're looking at an Iran right now where the hardline forces are supremely in control. They put down the Mahsa Amini protests. They have overseen this policy of funding proxies who fight Israel and repressing free speech inside Iran and expanding their influence throughout the region. So where does this leave us technically? With the president now dead, power has been transferred to Vice President Mohammad Mukhaber, and he's been approved as the acting president by the supreme leader. Many people are already saying, and I heard this on BBC, I've heard it by Crisis Group and Chatham House and others, this isn't going to change much of anything. The conservatives are in power, and that's just going to continue on. You know, a disorderer is going to disorder. It doesn't matter that this one cog in the wheel is out of the way, because the establishment has just really exerted its control over everything. But it makes me wonder, sometimes an implementer like Raisi is necessary to provide a face of structure. And with him out of the way, there could be a behind-the-scenes tussle for power, particularly those who don't want the current Ayatollah's son to take over should Khamenei die. Now his son is seeming to be the top candidate, and some people may oppose that. Also, we're going to be seeing the funeral of Raisi soon, and the Iranian people are going to be told that he was a martyr, and therefore some people are going to march in support of him, while others are going to use this as an opportunity to try to attack the Iranian regime. And in fact, maybe there will be a renewal of street protests against the regime. So that could be a destabilizing friction point. Another thing worth pointing out is that some conspiracy theorists, both inside Iran and elsewhere, will say maybe the Israelis were behind this. Maybe it wasn't just that the president and the foreign minister's helicopter encountered fog in northwestern Iran near the Azeri border when they were coming back from this opening of a dam at the Azeri border, but maybe there was foul play that the Israelis or the CIA was involved. That seems unlikely to me, one, because Israel never claims involvement in these things, but an anonymous Israeli source told the media that they were not involved, so that seems fairly definitive. Of course, that could be misinformation, but it seems unlikely. The Iranians haven't had spare helicopter parts in decades, and there was a lot of fog, and they may not know how to pilot these kind of things. So anything could have happened, and there's no reason to have a conspiratorial approach. But jokes are going around the internet that the fog was caused by the Mossad or that there was foreign meddling, and that could lead to some kind of Iranian counterattack to show that they're strong and they're standing up. It also could lead to the idea by Iranian dissidents that the regime is weak now, and now is the time to protest. The point is, even when a disorderer dies, it doesn't necessarily mean a victory for order. There's just another power vacuum, and we're unlikely to see a coordinated international response to figure out how to respond to this, and even the different elements within Iran are unlikely to be coordinated in their response. So I do think the death of this disorderer could lead to more disorder, but I don't want to over-exaggerate that or over-egg it, because he was just a functionary and he's likely to be replaced by similar hardliners. But watch this space, and we're going to make sure to have some new Iranian content for you in the upcoming weeks. And without further ado, back to our regular scheduled programming on the Russian counteroffensive in Kharkiv.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to understand what's going on in our mad, 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 mad world. So if you look outside today, on the 17th of May, the sun is shining, the flowers are in bloom, the days are getting longer, and here in the UK, rain is seemingly becoming less frequent. So, my dear orderers, what time of year does that make it? It's Russo-Ukrainian Summer Offensive Time. Yes, I'm joking, but only partially. The conflict in Ukraine has really set it into a pattern by now, and there's a seasonality to this pattern, and I would say that those rhythms are part and parcel of our era of enduring disorder. Unfortunately, as the summer of 2024 looms, it's been kicking off with the Russians on the offensive, and this is something that we could predict. There's been shelling in Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second city, and the Russians have been gaining territory, slowly, but they're gaining territory. They massed a lot of troops in northeastern Ukraine, and they're trying to advance on Kharkiv. The reports are that this attack has been blunted, but it may just be a feint for other offensives that could happen later in the south or in the eastern Donbass region. So, to kind of unpack what's going on and understand how this current offensive fits into the state of play in Ukraine, I am very honored to be joined by the much acclaimed military historian, Saul David. Saul is a Sunday Times best-selling military historian, novelist, and broadcaster. And I kid you not, he's had multiple books on the Sunday Times bestseller list. At present, his recently published Sky Warriors, British Airborne Forces in the Second World War, was number 8 last week on the Sunday Times bestseller list. We're going to pop a link in the show notes. It's a great read. I hope you can purchase a copy. In addition to Saul's page-turning military history books, he hosts our sister podcast, Battleground, and therefore his voice may sound familiar to you mega orderers out there. Battleground is also within the Goalhanger network, and I really enjoyed talking with his colleague, Patrick, about post-war governance of Gaza on his show. So without further ado, welcome to Disorder, Saul.
Thanks, Jason. Very good to be here.
So, news about the Ukraine war has been quite grim for the past 10 months or so. And now, added to this, we've heard about these recent Russian gains or offensives since Russia Victory Day. What really is going on in Kharkiv right now?
Well, it's very concerning, isn't it? And as you said in the introduction, it's really been one-way traffic since the end of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which, in the end didn't get anywhere close to what the Ukrainians hoped it would be. The Russians since then have been making gains. I mean, they captured the city of Avdiivka in Donetsk in particular, but they've also been nibbling away at Ukrainian defenses all along the line. But this most recent attack in Kharkiv is pretty worrying for a couple of reasons, actually. First of all, what it says about the ability of the Ukrainians to be able to defend their border. So imagine this, Jason. You've got a mad situation where the Ukrainians, now they're beginning to get more Western kit since the release of funding from both the US and the EU, but they can't actually fire those weapons into Russian territory. So where the Russians have just attacked from, they've literally just come over the border. And the reason there weren't any Ukrainian defenses there is because the Ukrainians know if they build them there, the Russians can attack them, but they can't fire out of those positions into Russia. So in effect, they've left that part of the border undefended. What's going to be interesting over the next week or so is how this develops, because they're now within about 20 kilometers of the city of Kharkiv, which is the second major city in Ukraine. And that is a city that, of course, the President Zelensky cannot afford to fall. It would be a really major problem for him. I don't think it's likely to anytime soon. And as you say, the situation seems to be stabilizing a bit, but it is concerning that they are now that close to this major city.
Yeah, I just want to sketch for the listeners the map a little bit closer for those who can't necessarily picture northeastern Ukraine. Kharkiv was a very important city in the Tsarist times, and it was near to some of the industrial industries, but it also has a famous university. I have been fortunate enough to go to the Kharkiv Botanical Gardens, which were a beautiful collection of plants and flowers from all of Europe and Central Asia. But the way that the Ukrainian border is drawn, it's extremely near to the Russian border. And because of exactly what you mentioned, this, to my mind, foolish Western and particularly American insistence, which is that offensive rockets and artillery shells are not used to attack positions inside Russia, it makes it really impossible to defend the border to the northeast of Kharkiv because it's too near to Russia, so that you can only defend it if you could attack into Russia where all of the artillery and bases for drones and stuff are. So having sketched that, I hope that that helps. I want to pick up on a thread that you mentioned there. Is the timing of this offensive because the Russians are well aware that new rounds of American and European kit are about to land, and that Ukraine is really at its weakest in terms of lacking artillery shells, lacking anti-drone and anti-aircraft defenses? And is that why we're seeing what we're seeing?
Yeah, it's almost certainly partly because of that. There's a window of opportunity for the Russians that they have been attempting to take advantage of for the last few months. They know the extra kit's on its way. But you are still faced with this issue, as we've been discussing, Jason, that even when the kit gets there, this is still a battleground. That is the battleground near Kharkiv, which it is difficult for the Ukrainians to defend. Although it's interesting that just this week, Zelensky asked for, in particular, 2 new Patriot batteries to be sited near the city so that it could be used to defend the Russian missiles coming in particular. And also, and this is where we hope there's going to be a change of policy, to fire into Russia, that is to use Patriot missiles to fire into Russia to take out fixed-wing aircraft. And the reason that's important is because one of the innovations the Russians have been using in recent weeks and months to devastating effect is the so-called glide bomb, which is basically a normal iron bomb with fins and GPS attached. And this can be released sometimes from up to 60 miles away from its target, and it sort of guides its way in there. And if you think about the border configuration, which you've just mentioned, Jason, this means, of course, that they can fire these weapons from inside Russia. So what Zelensky's asking for is not only Patriot batteries to take out the incoming ballistic missiles, but also the ability to knock out these aircraft, which are causing so much problems, not just for the Ukrainian troops now fighting to prevent this incursion, but also the attack on the city itself. And let's face it, in the longer term, the Ukrainians need the ability to actually target Russian artillery, which is firing from inside Russia and now against Kharkiv city, and the defense is close to it.
Yeah, and what's the potential that they are going to get that kit and have those restrictions lifted? Blinken just visited Kyiv on May 14. And during that visit, he promised that U.S. arms would make a quote-unquote real difference. And it does seem that some of the blockages that Speaker Johnson has put in Congress has been lifted, and various EU countries have passed new military aid deals. When is this kit really going to get to Ukraine, and when is its impact going to be felt? Will it be not for a couple of months? Will it be gradually, or is it going to all come online and make a real difference quite soon?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't know the answer to that yet. I mean, a lot of the mood music just prior to the release of the logjam, particularly in the US Congress, was that a lot of this kit had been stockpiled relatively close to the Ukrainian border, and it was going to be quite quick for it to get to where it needed to go. That's obviously happening at the moment, but we're not seeing any really clear sign that it's turning the tables against the Russians yet. I suspect it will over the next few weeks, certainly over the next few months. But within that window of opportunity, the Russians are still going to try and act and nibble away at as much territory as possible. One interesting thought as far as the recent Kharkiv incursion is concerned is that it may be an attempt by Putin to create a buffer zone. I mean, what he's been concerned with, certainly politically this isn't a good look, is these various incursions into Russia proper by not Ukrainian forces, but by Russian forces, but allied to the Ukrainians. In other words, anti-Putin Russian forces. This isn't a good look for him. They've been causing a lot of trouble. Occasionally, they've been staying for a day or two. And I think by creating this buffer zone, which is much more likely, in my view, as a war aim than a serious attempt to take Kharkiv city, which has 1.5 million inhabitants, it's obviously going to draw in a lot of Ukrainian defenders if there's a serious attempt to take it. And the third and interesting point about Kharkiv is that it was a city, of course, as we might imagine, based so close to Russia, that has a large ethnic Russian population. And there was the assumption, certainly I think by Putin and others, when the war started, that they were going to be welcomed into the city almost as liberators. Well, if even a small proportion of the city felt like that in 2022, they certainly don't now. That 1.5 million people, we know from talking to a number of people who've visited the city in recent times, are very anti-Russian or anti-Putin, even if they have Russian ethnic heritage. So there's going to be a stern defense, not only from the Ukrainian armed forces, but also from the people of the city themselves, I would imagine.
I want to propose another thesis of what might be going on. Yes, I've heard this buffer zone idea and that Russian advances towards Kharkiv, areas such as Vovkhansk or Buhru-Vatka, which are immediately to the northeast of Kharkiv, that these tank units and motorized rifle battalions might be attempt to create this buffer zone to prevent the incursions into Russia that Saul mentioned. But what about another thesis that this is a feint? And I've been reading some articles in Foreign Policy and Forbes, which I'm going to put in the show notes, which is that everyone knew this is the summer offensive season and the Western aid is going to be arriving, so Russia needs to do an attack. And they announced on May 9, Victory Day, they're going to do this attack. So everyone knows this attack, and they've been telegraphing this attack on Kharkiv. What if it's a feint to draw lots of Ukrainian troops that are in Donbass or in the south facing Kherson and Crimea up to the northeast, and then the quote-unquote real Russian summer offensive will come elsewhere, either in the east or the south? Is this something that one should be concerned about?
Yeah, it's possible. I think from the Ukrainian High Command's position, they have to take account of all possibilities, frankly. So they've sent a brigade, they've sent a veteran brigade up there, and that's already stiffened the defense up to Kharkiv. But it is absolutely vital, as you suggest, Jason, that you don't denude the defenses, particularly around Kasiv Yar, which is a tactically important location. It's on high ground. This is the city that is to the west of Bakhmut. And the analysts last year were suggesting one of the reasons the Russians wanted to take Bakhmut, quite apart from the fact that it was a symbolically important victory, is because ultimately they wanted to get to Kharkiv Yar, and that would allow them incursion deeper to the west. So it is absolutely true that they need to take account of the possible feint. And there's a long history of this in Russian warfare, actually, Jason. I mean, the Russian high command hasn't performed particularly well, as we know, since the start of this campaign. It's, a lot of so-called meat attacks throwing bodies at a problem, enormous numbers killed and wounded in the capture of Bakhmut, the same with Avdiivka, similar scenarios going on in Kharkiv Yar at the moment. And we suspect it will probably happen in and around Kharkiv too. But there is a danger that they could make a breakthrough before some of this kit arrives in time. The real problem that the Ukrainians have had, and I'm sure it's not alien to your listeners, is artillery shells. And it's interesting, isn't it, when we think of modern warfare, how much of things change? Is it all about movement? Is it about drones? I'm sure we'll go on to discuss those. But actually, artillery is still king to a certain extent on the battlefield. And it's the disproportion in terms of the shells that the Ukrainians have been able to fire. Sometimes we've heard figures of 1 to 10. Every 10 shells the Russians can fire, the Ukrainians can only fire 1, which has allowed a lot of these incursions to be made, and which has obviously put places like Kharkiv Yar under real threat of being captured. I don't think it's going to fall personally, but there is a danger, as you say, that there's a feint up north, and this will draw some of the more experienced troops away from these key areas.
So I proposed the feint thesis. You talked about the buffer zone. I want to talk about a third thesis of what might be happening before we zoom out. And this third thesis is very depressing. I heard about it first from Jade McGlynn, who writes in foreign policy, and we're going to put an article that she wrote in the show notes as well. She's a British academic based at Oxford. I know her through some friends of friends. And she was living in Kharkiv until recently, and she knew to get out just a week ago. Her thesis is that they're not really trying to take the city. They're not even really trying to have a buffer zone. They're not even really trying to feint. They're just trying to make life so horrible for so many Ukrainians, and essentially to turn Kharkiv into Mariupol. And listeners, what happened in Mariupol is what happened in Grozny and in Aleppo. It's this uniquely, quote unquote, Russian form of war, which is you just bomb the living daylights out of a place and destroy all of the apartment buildings, and you make the place into rubble because they don't have the tactical ability to retake the city. And on this question of artillery shells, I've heard a very freaky statistic, which is that in 1 month, North Korea can give more artillery shells to Russia than the EU in its entirety can supply to Ukraine in 1 year. And if you think about what that says about our not being in a war economy in the West, even crazier is what does it say about what the Russians can do with this artillery superiority if, they don't care about humans, they don't care about the rules of war and war crimes. So this last quote unquote thesis for what's happening is just to extract this horrible human price and making, Ukraine not really that livable for many Ukrainians.
It's a very believable thesis. I don't think it needs to be either or, to be honest, Jason. As in war, any sensible high command will have multiple different objectives. I often wonder myself how joined up the Russian thinking is. And in the end, they do tend to resort to, the blunt instrument to solve the problem. It's a very convincing thesis. As I say, I don't think it's either or. I think they are doing it and have been doing it and will continue to do it. But the reason that the Kharkiv scenario is so alarming in terms of what the Russians might be able to do there, and of course, this incursion could be linked to that because it's getting the artillery a little bit closer to the city and therefore able to cause even more damage, is that unquestionably one element of their arsenal, as it were, is just to make conditions as you suggest, so terrible for the inhabitants that, they're eventually going to empty out the city. The city has still got 1.5 million people or thereabouts living in it, and they haven't been intimidated yet. But obviously, the more attack they come under in terms of artillery shells, the bigger the problem they've got. But just as a quick counterpoint, so the listeners don't get too depressed at your statistic, which I'm sure is accurate, actually, about the North Korean shells and the fact that Europe certainly hasn't really geared up to war economies yet, for the obvious reasons that we territorially aren't directly threatened so far, is that, yes, you can fire off a lot of artillery shells, but artillery positions are vulnerable to attack from other systems. The HIMARS that the Ukrainians have got, lots of other long-range missile systems, the Scalp, which we've talked about, the Storm Shadow, the ATACMS. But, and here's the important point, and we're going round in circles really here, the Ukrainians need the ability to fire these weapons where they want to fire them. And if it's in Russia, then they are absolutely legitimate targets. So that's really the key change that's needed in the short term, in my view, which is, and I think we're probably moving in that direction. I mean, it was interesting. We talked before, didn't we, about the fact that the Ukrainians are demanding the ability to use these weapons in Russian territory. Well, even some US sources are now beginning to move in that direction. Blinken said during his recent visit, he wasn't averse to the Ukrainians using their weapons where they wanted to use them. He wasn't going to tell them how to do that. US officials, on the other hand, are briefing that they haven't changed the policy, but it may be getting closer to a change of policy because the US Helsinki Commission, staffed by members of Congress, but also members of the administration, have begun to recommend that there's a raising of that veto. So we could be getting closer to that situation. And if we do, even if the Ukrainians don't have parity in artillery shells, which is unlikely that they ever will have, they might have the ability to knock out some of these artillery positions.
I think now we've done a really good job. It's never going to be comprehensive, but a good job of painting a picture of the current state of play with this quote-unquote Kharkiv Russian offensive. Why don't we zoom out for our listeners? I'd like to take advantage of the fact that you've been covering this week in and week out for the entire duration of the war. So if you could, zoom out not to the 30,000 foot, but like the 400,000 foot level, why have the dynamics of the war in 2023 and 2024 so massively favored the defense, while in 2022, the situation had certain advantages for the attacker, both the Russian attacker initially, but then the Ukrainian counterattacker? What's kind of changed technically over these last 2 or so years?
Well, the key moment, I think, was the construction of this huge defensive belt by Russia at the end of 2022. So you saw, of course, the initial incursion by Russia, which got a lot of ground. I mean, it captured a lot of ground. They got very close to Kharkiv and a number of other locations before they were eventually driven back. And then, of course, we saw the successful counteroffensives by the Ukrainians retaking a lot of ground in the Kharkiv Oblast, of course, and also Kherson. The only regional capital that had actually been captured by the Russians was retaken by the Ukrainians. And that war of movement seemed to us at the end of 2022 to be very much favoring the Ukrainians. They were much more nimble, more adept. They had a lot of good Western weaponry, including artillery systems and also HIMARS. And everyone was reasonably optimistic that they were going to be able to recapture more ground. So what did the Russians do? They constructed what became known as the Surovikin line, after the general who was behind that initial plan, to build, in effect, a Maginot line, if we go back to the pre-Second World War analogy, Jason, which is just a massive defensive belt across the whole of the front line, consisting of trench systems, Dragon's Teeth, which is an anti-tank trap, and, most importantly, huge minefields, thousands of minefields, kilometers in depth, which meant that when the Ukrainians actually tried their long-delayed, and the long delay is important, of course, because if it had been launched earlier, these defenses would not have been completed and would not have been so sophisticated. They came up against this almost immovable object, because what you get with these defensive systems is they slow up mobile warfare. They stop tanks and armored personnel carriers from moving at speed at which point they are vulnerable to two things: artillery fire, but more importantly, drones. Drones can hover above tanks. And you've seen that if anything, this war has taught us anything. Modern battle tanks are very vulnerable to drone-type warfare. They're vulnerable to lots of things. They're also vulnerable to helicopters, of course, with rockets, but they're particularly vulnerable to drones. So the stasis on the battlefield caused by these defensive systems has allowed drones really to become the dominant mode of weapon on the battlefield.
What I want to ask you then is, when the Ukrainians faced this in their 2023 summer offensive, and they weren't ready because they had done so well in 2022, they didn't get how much the defense would be favored by these changes. Let's say that they hopefully resist this attack in the Northeast now, and in the next months or 2 months, they are bringing in the American and European kit, and now it's full summer offensive season, say in July. What have they learned? How can they regain territory given these changes that seem to favor the defense? Or is there very little that can be done, to your mind?
Well, they can do a couple of things. You mentioned the Maginot Line, and they went round it, as you also pointed out. There is a way to get around these Russian defensive systems, and that's attack into Russia proper. But again, that will require a change in policy, because the sort of kit that the Ukrainians are being armed with now, the main battle tanks and the planes that are coming on stream, are all weapons that, at least as far as the policy exists today, cannot be used in Russia proper. But we've had listeners utterly mystified that there hasn't been an attack from the sort of region that the Russians have just attacked from, but going in the other direction, so that you get behind all these defenses. Well, we know the reason why that hasn't happened. So that's one possibility. But there's one other thing they can do, actually, even if the situation remains as it is, and that isn't the case, and that is the possibility that at some stage in the near future, with more Patriot batteries and, more importantly, more modern Western airplanes, in particular the F-16s, which are supposed to be coming on stream too, then they can wrest a bit of control over the air. Because we've talked about artillery. Artillery is vulnerable from attack from the air, both from missiles, but also from planes and longer distance munitions, HIMARS, and other things like that. But to be effective, particularly with the planes, you need command of the air. And if the Ukrainians are able to wrest that, and they might be able to with some of the new kit that's coming on stream in the summer, then you could possibly see a breakthrough, once again, a war of movement, using the tanks and the armored personnel carriers, which they have still got in large numbers of stocks. I mean, I've been asking some of our sources out there, people in the Ukrainian armed forces, what's happened to all the Challengers? Well, they've got them ready to go. They've got Abrams ready to go. They've got Leopards ready to go. Yes, they've lost a few, but hardly any compared to the total amount they have. So there is a large armored striking force that could do some real damage if the Ukrainians are able to wrest control a bit of the air. And when we think about the so-called NATO doctrine in how to fight, it always demands you have control of the air. I mean, you could see that in Normandy in 1944, and it hasn't changed today. So if the Ukrainians are able to get a bit more control of the air, then we could see a bit more movement.
I think, Saul, you've painted a really good picture of the different dynamics that have been favoring the defense, where the state of play in Donbass and elsewhere in Kherson is for our listeners. Now I want to pivot to some other issues that the war raises. Let's talk about leadership. Less than 2 weeks ago, it emerged that the Russians had tried to assassinate President Zelensky. And it turns out that they've tried on many previous occasions, but this plot against his life in early may have had a higher degree of sophistication and a greater chance of success. How was it detected? What are the chances the Russians will try again to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership? And is Ukraine trying to decapitate Russian military or political leadership? Is that another realm of the war which is not discussed or understood, but might be even more decisive than some of these, artillery or tank battle issues?
Yeah, well, the answer to the first bit of the question is that it was detected by the SBU, which is the Ukraine's security service, which reported on the 7th of May that it had exposed, and I quote, a network of Russian Federal Security Service operatives who were planning to assassinate Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other high-ranking Ukrainian intelligence and military officials, including the head of military intelligence, Kirilo Budanov. Now, the reason that's important, the Budanov connection, is because if anyone's going to be doing a similar thing in Russia, it'll be under Budanov's orders. And we know that, there have been various attempts to take out people in Russia, occasionally successfully, certainly in occupied Ukraine, by Budanov's operatives. But just getting back to the plot itself, the reason it was so dangerous is because apparently it involved two colonels of Ukraine's Office of State Security, whose job is to protect Zelensky. So you've basically got people from the inside, and they were recruited, so the SBU claim, even before the full-scale invasion. So these are kind of sleeper agents that the Russians have been sitting on, as it were, and waiting to activate. The plot itself sounded a bit half-baked, I have to say, Jason, when we heard a bit more detail. And this, again, is coming from the SBU. They said the enemy's plan was as follows. First, the recruited agent had to observe the movement of the person under guard and pass information to the enemy. And then it was planned to launch a missile attack on the coordinates of the house where the official was supposed to be hit. Then they were going to attack the people who remained at the affected area, etc., etc. So basically, the operatives are going to capture, hold, and then locate the place where either Zelensky or Budanov were, and then missiles are going to come in from the Russians to take them out. I mean, lots and lots of things can go wrong, too many moving parts, in my opinion. But nevertheless, if it's true that they did have people on side within Zelensky's security detail, that is very concerning. Can the Ukrainians turn the tables? I mean, I would suggest that an authoritarian leader like Putin actually is incredibly difficult to get at. We saw in the Second World War how hard it was to kill Hitler. They got pretty close. And again, how close did they get? Well, they got close because they actually used people who had direct access to him. And I'm of course, talking about members of the German armed forces themselves who were fed up with Hitler. Although, interestingly, the key character himself, who planted the famous bomb plot, was quite a staunch nationalist. And you could say that at some stage, there may be people within Russia who absolutely believe in the bigger project, but also believe that Putin's not going to succeed in the way he's going about it, and that the Ukraine war has actually been a disaster for Russia, which of course it has been. But, for people senior in the Russian security apparatus to get their heads around that, it's going to take that before they're prepared to do anything.
Speaking still on the question of military leadership, what is the state of the Ukrainian military leadership? We heard a while back that some of the military top brass were replaced because some people were tainted with the setbacks of last year, and that maybe Zelensky had some falling out with some of the military people because he's more of a civilian in his outlook. I haven't been able to follow the details. I don't really understand the internal workings of the Ukrainian leadership, military or civilian. How would you talk us through this?
Well, the key man was replaced, and that is Valery Zaluzhny, who was the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. I suspect Zelensky, if he'd had complete freedom of movement, he would have replaced him last autumn when Zaluzhny gave an interview, I think it was to The Economist, in which he talked about the war being at a stalemate, that they needed better technology to make a difference, that is the Ukrainian armed forces. And here was the controversial point he made, they needed 500,000 extra recruits, because this whole business of the number of people fighting in the Ukrainian army is a real political issue. Zelensky understandably didn't take kindly to what he felt was an interference in political affairs. And I think he was storing up the possibility that when the moment was ripe, he was going to strike and get rid of Zaluzhny. The problem he had is that Zaluzhny is very popular. I mean, I think his approval ratings at around this time were about 82%, whereas Zelensky's had dropped to about 62%. But that also fed into another fear that Zelensky had, which is that Zaluzhny might have political ambitions. So I would suggest that the replacement of Zaluzhny was as much about politics as it was about military sphere. Certainly, Zaluzhny was very popular with the ordinary rank and file in Ukraine, and it wasn't popular from their behalf. We spoke to a number of people, actually, who said they were very angry with what had happened. He was replaced by a man called Syrsky, Alexander Syrsky, who had been the ground forces commander, so he's really stepping one up from that. And Syrsky had made his name with the defense of Kyiv, so he's also known as a kind of hero of Ukraine of the war since the full-scale invasion. But why would Zelensky choose him over Zaluzhny? Well, he's more of a yes man. He's less likely to rock the boat and certainly less of a political threat. So that's really what's going on in a nutshell. But the overriding problem that Zaluzhny pointed out, which is that the war had hit the buffers and that they needed more Ukrainian men to join up to fight. That still has not been properly resolved, although there have been some moves to extend conscription down from its minimum age of 27. It's hard to believe, isn't it, Jason, when we think people who fought in the Second World War, and I'm writing about it at the moment, were really in their late teens and early 20s, to reduce that age from 27 to 25, which has recently taken place.
To outside observers, it may seem surprising that the Ukrainian conscription age has always been so high. And I was going to ask you about that next, because there are many dynamics internal to the Ukrainian politics and to the Ukrainian psyche, which may confound us outside onlookers. And I haven't understood the popularity of certain military figures inside Ukraine, and Zelensky's needing to handle them with kid gloves to maintain the support of his people. But the thing that has most mystified me as I read articles about internal Ukrainian politics is this issue of the conscription age. It's not just in World War II that 18-year-olds fought. Even in Vietnam, it was, when there was any conscription, it was for people between 18 and 21. Obviously, in Israel, after high school, the conscripts go to the army. And if they're going to fight, they're fighting, and they're in their late teens and early 20s. I think that some specialist units that are maybe fighting in Gaza have some people in their mid to late 20s, but the bulk of any Israeli non-reservist force is going to be under 24. What is the logic for that choice?
Well, there's two things going on. One is a practical reason, actually. And the practical reason is that the age group that you have been talking about, which is 18 to 27 or 18 to 25 now they've reduced it a little bit, actually is statistically very small in Ukraine at the moment. It's a statistical anomaly that the population birth 20 years or so ago, or 25 years ago, was very low. So it's a relatively small group in entirety. And the point being that even if you did reduce conscription down to 18, you're not going to add enormous numbers of people, although obviously you're going to add a few. The other point is that there seems to be an attempt to shield what some people describe as the sort of future, the youth, the flower of Ukraine's population from death and maiming on the battlefield. So it's a mixture of those two things. But the practical factor is important, I think, so that even though they've reduced the age now down to 25, that's not going to add an enormous number of people. And the consequences of all of this is that a relatively small number of people, let's talk about up to 1 million, say, in arms at the moment. But if we think about 1 million, Jason, only 200,000 of those are actually doing the fighting at the sharp end of the armed forces. And the fact that they aren't able to rotate them out quickly enough means that the morale among the frontline soldiers is dipping quite alarmingly. And this is a big problem. So there are a couple of solutions to this. You do reduce the conscription age further, although, as I say, that's not going to add an enormous number of people, and it will be unpopular for other reasons. But the other thing you do is you really tackle the draft dodgers. A lot of people have moved outside of Ukraine to avoid actually having to serve in the armed forces. So the question is, can they get some of those guys back? Can they do deals with places like Poland to send some of them back? But also, our own trip to Kyiv last summer, we could see an awful lot of young guys in the city of Kyiv and other cities, Lviv, who, were driving around in fast cars, enjoying the cafe life. It was almost as though a war wasn't on. And that's not a good look, frankly, when a relatively small amount of the population, what is the total population of Ukraine? About 46 million, I think. And as I say, only 1 million or so are actually doing the fighting. Now, if you go back to the First World War, just to give you an example, France's population was similar to Ukraine's as it is now, and yet it had 13 million men under arms. So it's not as though they can't find more bodies if they absolutely are determined to do it. It's just that politically, it's a very sensitive issue for Zelensky, which is why he doesn't want to go there.
And after the break, has Navalny's murder actually changed anything on the battlefield?
I'm Alex Rodriguez.
And I'm Jason Kelly.
From Bloomberg, this is The Deal. Each week, you'll hear us in conversation with business icons.
This show will explore deal-making across sports, media, and entertainment.
That is a harsh lesson in business.
Sports is not as simple as bringing a bunch of big names together.
I didn't want to do another stomp you out speech.
It opened up so many more doors.
The show is called The Deal.
Listen to The Deal.
Listen to The Deal on Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. You know Amazon Prime is not just a shipping subscription, right? It's got everything, including streaming TV and movies on Prime Video. And of course, Prime's fast, free shipping. Go from watching your favorite shows to getting your favorite things. Whatever you're into, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
The people at KPMG make the difference for their clients. Talented teams leveraging the right technology to uncover insights that illuminate opportunity. KPMG teams together with their clients, working shoulder to shoulder with them to help grow and transform their enterprise. Are you ready to make the difference together? Go to visit.kpmg.us/transformation to learn more.
We haven't really been hearing much about Navalny's death and how his murder might have affected not only events on the battlefield, but the morale of Russians and Ukrainians. I know from my Ukrainian friends that they're like, we're sorry that Navalny got killed, but he was a Russian after all, and he was a nationalist, and we don't cry any tears for him. Not that he would have done the same war, but he's not like a tree hugger. And on the Russian side, those who oppose Putin and would support someone like Navalny were already opposing this war. And those who really support Putin, they were against Navalny and they don't care that he's killed. So when I'm looking back, I have a few questions here. One, has it really changed anything? And two, Biden had promised previously that there would be devastating consequences if Navalny was ever assassinated. It certainly doesn't seem that promise has come to pass. And it reminds me of Obama's red line in Syria. When you say something and you're the president of the United States, it's quite different when European leaders say these things because they can't enforce them. But when you're the president of the United States and the commander-in-chief of the world's most powerful army, and you say there will be devastating consequences if Navalny is killed, and then he is killed and very little happens, what kind of message should that send? Where are we?
Yeah, well, I mean, the simple answer is it hasn't really changed anything specific. And you made the point about foolish to make these threats and not do anything about it. Well, virtually nothing has been done. Biden, immediately after Navalny's death, promised measures against people connected with the imprisonment of Navalny. I mean, we're really talking about prison bosses here. The Western governments, I suppose, would arguably try and slip out of this. I don't know if they specifically have, but arguably try and slip out of this by saying, well, yeah, we're pretty convinced he was murdered, but there is no incontrovertible proof. He could have died as a consequence of neglect or maltreatment, which in my view is the same thing personally. But moving on from the immediate measures put in place, there has been one really important result, I think, in my mind, to the death of Navalny, and that's concentrated the minds of some of the refuseniks in Congress in particular, or at least open their eyes to the true nature of the Russian regime. Now, you may ask yourself, why did they need their eyes open? But Navalny's death did seem to coincide with a little bit of a change of mood, particularly among those Republicans in the House of Representatives who were opposing the aid to Ukraine. And I think that it may have played a little part in freeing up that money, which, of course, is so important. 60 billion locked up, now freed. We'll have to wait and see what happens at the end of the year with the presidential election. But this is certainly going to allow Ukraine to survive and possibly regain, as we said, in a summer counteroffensive, a bit more ground during the course of 2024.
I was really honored to have Bill Browder on episode 26 of the Disorder Pod. And he and I discussed ways that money of Russia's that's already frozen, and these are Russian central bank assets that were invested or stored in the West or Western currencies, which are frozen. They've been frozen the whole time. Could they be seized to help Ukraine? I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Bill Browder's discussion of that with me. Bill said this should happen via coordinated Navalny acts. This has not exactly come to pass, but it does seem that the Europeans are now passing along interest on those frozen assets to the Ukrainians, so that the principal has not been seized, but the winnings that those assets are still kicking off are being passed to the Ukrainians. And this is in the low billions rather than in the hundreds of billions if the whole principal was seized. This leads to two questions. Do those little bit of billions matter? And then why is the Russian frozen money simply frozen? Why is it not being handed to Ukraine when Navalny's death would have provided the perfect pretext to just take it and give it to them?
Well, the answer is, does the money matter? That is the interest you mentioned. It's about 2.5 billion euros, I think. And of course, more would be coming in as the time goes on. That, of course, matters because it's cash that the Ukrainians can put towards weapons and anything else they want to use it for. But why have they not gone further? Well, there is still this kind of unwillingness to effectively steal what is Russian money. An idea that, yeah, we can take the interest, but we can't take the principal. Are they worried about, Western assets being seized? Possibly. Are they worried about the consequences of that? But I think there are some indications, actually, Jason, that the use of the interest is a slippery slope, and we may be heading down a track where the principal is seized in entirety. On his recent visit to Kyiv, Blinken spoke about the possibility of Russia paying for Ukraine's reconstruction when the war is over. And this money might come, at least in part, from those frozen Russian assets. So already the principle of using that money for Ukraine after the war is being discussed. And I think it's possible, as the war continues, that the likelihood that some of the actual principle is going to be handed over to Ukraine is very likely. So it was a good sign, I think, that the EU passed the use of the interest. Where that will lead in the next few months, we don't know for sure. But in my view, I think that is a slippery slope to actually taking the principle too.
Moving on to our penultimate topic, let's talk a little history and some parallels here. Saul, you're a historian by training, and as am I. And when I look at the war in Ukraine, I see a few historical parallels that jump out and that illuminate where we're at in our global system. What strikes you before I try to put any words in your mouth?
Well, the most obvious one that we keep returning to on the podcast is that Russia now is Germany in the 1930s. Well, it's really Germany in 1939. But the lead up to this was very interesting because what you got, of course, with the seizure of Crimea is a kind of Czech scenario in 1938. So the German government says, well, we're going to take the bit of the Czechoslovakia that has Germans in it, the Sudetenland. And then they, of course, go one step further and they take the whole of Czechoslovakia. And even that's not enough to force the Western allies to declare war on Germany. It takes a similar scenario the following year, Gdansk, the Polish corridor, and the invasion of Poland before we're going to do anything about it. Well, you had almost the exact same scenario with the same justifications. The need to reunite the peoples of Russia in the 1930s. It was the lost peoples of Germany. This justification, which the Russians are still using, not only for the war in Ukraine, but for what might come after, which is why the support for the Ukrainians is so important, which is why the former Secretary General of NATO, George Robertson, said recently, stopping Russia in Ukraine is about the defense of Europe, really. We need to think of it in those terms, because if you encourage an aggressive power, if you allow them to get away, particularly when they're using the sort of justification that Russia is using, then they will continue to do it. It becomes a monster that needs to feed itself with new acquisitions. And it becomes a political issue within Russia that almost demands you keep moving forward. You almost can't stop it once you start it.
This is what I call an appeasement cycle, Saul. And I love that you came back to this 1930s parallel, because there is a view that, everyone compares everything to Hitler, and they say anti-Semitism is like the Holocaust, and they say the Ukraine war is like, the appeasement of World War II. But there is a dynamic going on here which is critical, which is that appeasement begets more appeasement because of a structural logic. If you have an opponent and he has X amount of money and Y amount of territory, and you appease him, oh, sure, you can take Crimea and we'll do nothing. Oh, you can take Donbass. Oh, you can do this. But then the next bit, that's too much. The problem is that the more that you give, one, the less that your threats mean anything, and two, the more territory and greater power he has. So appeasement inherently begets more appeasement. And this dynamic that is obvious to you and I as people who read and write history may not be obvious structurally to our leaders, which is that you're in a stronger position to enforce, hey, Hitler, you can't do X and Y and Z with the Anschluss or the Sudetenland before they've absorbed that territory and then mobilized again and built up their war economy again. And we were in a much stronger position to stop Putin in 2014 than we are now. And I see this as super important for what we can ascertain about the global enduring disorder, which is that if we were really, really hard-nosed about climate change in the 1990s or early 2000s when Al Gore began, talking about this and saying we needed to do things, it was a lot easier than it is now. If in Libya, when there was the first introduction of Wagner mercenaries and Turkish mercenaries and the Turkish General Staff, we said, hey, there are going to be sanctions for the use of these mercenaries. It's a lot easier than when that thing becomes so embedded and there are so many dynamics that our opponents are so much stronger. And that, to me, is probably also my biggest takeaway on what the Ukraine war has to do about the global enduring disorder, which is that a stitch in time saves nine. So it's time to grow a pair immediately when it comes to things like tax havens or climate change, because if we don't do it now, it's only going to be so much harder later.
There is still an opportunity, Jason, to see, I know it's hard for the Ukrainians to see it this way, but for the West to see the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, actually as a key moment, as an opportunity for us to see the real danger that was, in front of our face, or it should have been in front of our face, and to do something about it. I mean, NATO's reaction, what was the way it was described by Macron just a few years ago? NATO was brain dead. Well, NATO is no longer brain dead. It's still got a long way to go, but it's heading in the right direction. And I think that's a tremendously important development just in terms of security. And you're talking about all the other things, but we do need to see the Ukraine war as an opportunity to reset as the Western world. And as you say, to grow a pair.
Nice. And I'll toss out one other historical parallel. I wonder if we're in a position as a global system not so different than where we were at the start of the 20th century. At the start of the 20th century, there was a rising Germany. It had expanding industrial power. It was unhappy with the status quo, where Britain and France had all the colonies and Russia had this huge amount of territory. Germany said, hey, we're boxed in, but we're the dynamic, growing industrial power. We don't mind provoking a conflagration because that'll, overturn the apple cart. And we have the strength that if things were revisited and there was a new order, we would get a greater share of the pie. And looking at this Ukraine situation, we haven't mentioned the word China the whole episode. And it seems like you can't talk about how this Ukraine war has been allowed to happen without mentioning China. China is today's rising power. The mid-21st century is China's time, kind of where Germany was at the start of the 20th century. They have this growing and expanding economy. They're the industrial powerhouse. Is it not incorrect that they are happy for the wars in Ukraine and Gaza to continue, to disorder the global system, so that then they could say, look, the West and Russia have just expended themselves on this pointless wars. The American youth are busy burning their own campuses and not studying. And our youth are getting their engineering degrees. And now all this disorder means it's our time. We're going to march into this disordered world and take over a lot of economic and political heft.
Yeah, I think the point you make is a good one. The historical parallels don't quite work with Germany because Germany well, at least in my view, they don't, because Germany was prepared rather recklessly in 1914 to risk a war that it thought it could win because it was running out of time, because other powers becoming more powerful in a military sense, but not in an industrial sense. And that's really the big miscalculation for Germany. That's not a miscalculation, in my view, that China is likely to make. It still doesn't overturn your thesis. I think your thesis is absolutely right. The reason China is so dangerous to the West, the attempt to get an ordered world, is because it does benefit from disorder, and it will attempt to get everything it needs without actually fighting. So it's almost making the calculation, we'll let the Russians fight, we'll let the Iranians fight, and we will maneuver into a position where we're actually able to, as you say, exert more and more economic influence and power, in a sense, in the world. You don't need to actually fight to exert power. Russia could have got a lot of what it wanted to in Ukraine without actually fighting, which is why the history books will say, this is one of the most catastrophic decisions Putin ever took. I don't think the Chinese are going to do that, but it does make them incredibly dangerous. So the Americans, of course, are concerned that they're going to invade Taiwan. I don't think they're going to take that step personally. I think they'll try and, maneuver it, maybe negotiate, but the idea that you actually invade somewhere, no, then you create a kind of, uncertain scenario with war, as we know, which can go either way. I don't think the Chinese are going to do that, but they are undoubtedly benefiting from a disordered world.
Okay, Saul, let's order the disorder. Looking out from London at Ukraine and the Taiwanese Straits, it doesn't look like there's a lot of order out there. What more can the West be doing to help Ukraine, to help Taiwan, that we're not doing to help prevent some disorderly conflagration from erupting?
Well, the most important thing is sending a strong signal to the authoritarian states that benefit from disorder that actually what they're attempting to achieve is not going to work. And the best way you can do that is to deter. And in the case of the Ukraine war, of course, and also arguably Taiwan v. China, you need to make it pretty clear that there are going to be consequences. Well, the Ukraine war is underway, okay? So Russia needs to be stopped there physically. And the way you do that is by giving the Ukrainians the weapons it needs to fight. And this has, been a real point of issue on our podcast for the last 2 years because we've been drip feeding them what they need to fight. So they need to be given that stuff now, more planes, more tanks, more air defense systems, more long-range missiles, including from Germany, the Taurus missile, which, by the way, is apparently uniquely kind of designed that it would be very effective in knocking out the Kerch Bridge. Why is that important? Because the Russians can bring in their supplies into the Crimea. But I also think a strong signal needs to be sent to China. I think it has been actually, but the best signal of all to send to China in terms of don't even go there as far as an invasion of Taiwan is concerned, is to show them the consequences of a misguided war of aggression in Ukraine. That is, Russia loses and it pays the economic and political price for doing so.
Yeah, I want to recommend to listeners Saul and Patrick Bishop's Battleground podcast. In addition to giving a lot of the tactical updates in terms of things that are happening, I think you guys order the disorder quite well because you bring a lot of moral clarity. And of course, you don't want to oversimplify, but there is a need for the kind of moral clarity that you guys have on your podcast, which is that the war which is happening in Ukraine is a war for the rules-based international order. And it is a war for democracy and many of these kind of very simplistic things that are actually at stake there. So given that, you've had really good episodes about how different European countries relate to Ukraine differently. You had one recently about Germany. So we're more than 2 years on from the Zeitenwende now. Why is the German response in terms of giving weapons and also speaking with moral clarity so out of step with other Western and NATO nations? It's not something that I fully understand. I don't read German. I do read French. And I know that the Germans have their own legacy of the Second World War, but didn't they announce this Zeitenwende? What should Germany be doing to order the disorder and be in step with its allies?
Well, Germany's an economic powerhouse. It's the most powerful economy in Europe. It could have a very effective military. It doesn't. It's wound down. It was pretty decent towards the end of the Cold War. But since the end of the Cold War, and also for historical reasons relating to the Second World War and the kind of sense of pacifism is best, you've had this mindset that Germany is not going to use its military muscle. So that's the first problem to get over. But there's another problem specifically related to Russia. And that is, again, for historical reasons, there's a strong strain of Russophilia in Germany. Interestingly, Jason, on both sides of the political spectrum. So I think everyone will get the left, the fact that GDR was closely associated with Russia. But it's more than that. There's also a strain on the right that's very sympathetic towards Russia. So we were told recently on the podcast, business people in Germany who feel that they would be much more happily aligned with Russia in terms of doing business because they believe this will feed into some kind of, political association that's going to avoid war. And they use the example, well, when we actually opposed Russia, when we were up against Russia in the two world wars, that brought disaster. But this is a complete misreading of the situation, in my view. I mean, you've got to see Russia as an aggressive nation now. Germany is part of the rules-based order. It's part of NATO, as you say, Jason. And its responsibility is to wield its economic muscle in a military sense. But I should also add, Jason, it's not as if it hasn't been doing anything. Actually, Germany is the second biggest supplier in terms of value of weapons to Ukraine of anywhere in the world, and that's after the US. It's just that it's drip-fed all its kit, and it's really been forced to hand over things like its Leopard tanks, and it still hasn't handed over its Taurus missiles. Meanwhile, the Brits, and I'm going to big up the British for just a second here, have handed over their Storm Shadow missiles a long time ago, and they've had a certain amount of effect, particularly against the Russian Navy. But they've also now said, which the Americans should be doing too, that the Ukrainians can use these long-range missiles against targets in Russian territory. So that's another reason why I think maybe we're moving closer to a scenario where the rest of NATO will follow suit.
Two final questions. I feel that we can't end a pod talking about the Ukraine war without mentioning China or Gaza. So we've mentioned China. And in your Battleground pod, you do talk a bit about Gaza and you present some of the battlefield developments there. This maybe gives you some unique insights. How has the Gazan war affected overall battlefield developments in Ukraine? And given the moral complexities of the Gazan war, which do not really exist in the Ukrainian one, what can we do to isolate the Gazan theater from the Ukrainian theater so that we can get on with the business of winning in Ukraine?
Well, at first, we feared, and I think there was a fear among Western analysts generally, that the Gazan conflict was going to seriously impact on Ukraine, certainly the West's support for Ukraine, because a lot of the US arms that had been promised for Ukraine would instead go to Israel. And at first it seemed as if that was happening. Now, we now know with the 60 billion package coming to Ukraine, that's no longer an issue. And if anything, and this is an interesting observation, I think, to make, the Gazan conflict has been good for Ukraine because it's reminded Americans generally, American congressmen in particular, that there is an axis of authoritarian regimes who are working together to disorder the world, as you would put it, Jason, including in Ukraine, and they need to be combated. So I think, I know a lot of people are looking at the two conflicts and saying, well, it's a lot easier to see who the good guys are in Ukraine. But actually, I think that, the people who've got any sense are realizing the same sort of evil is present in Gaza in the form of Hamas and the people who back Hamas. And of course, Russia gets drawn into this because ultimately it backs or it's allied to Iran and has also welcomed a lot of senior Hamas leaders to Moscow in recent years, that it's become a lot clearer, I think, for Americans and congressmen in particular, and that's important, to see that there is a major threat out there and it needs to be combated at all points, not just one or two.
Interesting. Last question. If you were global orderer-in-chief for a day, what is the one implementable suggestion you'd propose to help the West, help Ukraine?
Well, it would be two-edged, I think, but linked. NATO, in my view, is the best guarantor of European security now and in the future. So I would insist, first of all, that every member of NATO meets the minimum requirement, which has been in place for a long time, and that's to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. Last year, only 11 out of 31 members met that threshold. This year, it apparently is going up to 18, but it really should be all 31. So that would be the first demand. But the second thing I would say is that all members of NATO need to supply at least a proportion of their modern military kit to Ukraine, including planes, long-range missiles, and air defenses. And just to repeat the point, that they allow Ukraine to use their weapons in any way they see fit, apart from, and this is my only caveat, the deliberate targeting of civilians.
From your mouth to God's ears, those are some excellent suggestions. And I've learned a lot from the ways that you've connected various tactical developments in Ukraine with strategic and political developments. I would like to urge Disorder listeners to check out Saul and Patrick Bishop's Battleground pod. It is a great overview and helps you follow what's going on the ground. I hope that we can be on each other's podcasts more frequently, Saul.
Yeah, I love the idea that there's a bit of, cross-fertilization between podcasts generally, but in particular between the Goalhanger podcast. You're doing some great work, Jason, with Disorder. Much power to your elbow, and thank you for asking me on.
So, Orderers, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please tap follow right now. And in the show notes, you can also follow our Substack, where I'm going to mention a lot about what's going on tactically in Ukraine and explain the maps and the front line and all of that. So I think you might enjoy that. As always, our producer has been George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. I hope you have an orderly week. And when you counterattack, make sure that you have a preponderance of force of 3-1. Clausewitz tells you this leads to an orderly and successful counterattack. Bye for now.